For last 30 seconds of our session, of course we'll prolong. We have Andriy Zayarnyuk, who was already presented here, but I would just like to mention that his topics revolve around Ukrainian peasantry and Ukrainian railway stations. And those of you who have been in Lviv and have seen the magnificent railway station there can really only envy Andriy that he had the wonderful idea and wonderful execution of a history of the station and its people. And his other books were about Ukrainian peasantry and their growing of national or non-national consciousness. I would say that even before Tarazara appeared, you were working on the problem of lack of national identity or among the peasants, and now the floor is yours.
With your permission, I'll just sit here, and it will be easier for me with my laptop. So I'll try to be brief, and thankfully, the title you have in your conference programs for my paper is a bit misleading. So I won't talk about Ukrainian culture. I'll talk about something much simpler and something you all are familiar with, namely the significance of Galicia for the Ukrainian national project. Very simple topic. We all know that the founding fathers of modern Ukraine, all those poets, writers, scholars from the Russian Empire, writing mostly in the 1830s, 1840s, they don't write about Galicia. Right? Galicia doesn't really register on their mental map, and it all changes only in the second half of the 19th century, after 1848, and especially starting with the 1860s. And of course, this timing is not accidental, because for the Ukrainian intellectuals, and eventually in both the Russian Empire and the Habsburg Empire, the first conceptualization of Galicia was freedom. That's how they think about Galicia in the second half of the 19th century, all the way to 1917, right, to the revolution. So starting with the 1880s, Ukrainian intellectuals from the Russian Empire designate Galicia as the Ukrainian Piedmont. And of course, they all know about economic problems of Galicia. So it's not about economic development. They know that real power, political power in the province is in the hands of the Polish nobility. Nevertheless, there are freedoms, right? There are constitutional freedoms, there is parliamentary democracy, and they are turning Galicia into this Ukrainian Piedmont, the new center of the Ukrainian nation building. And in 1906, Mikhailo Hrushevsky, the most famous Ukrainian historian of all times, in his article, The Ukrainian Piedmont, basically confirms that, yes, Galicia indeed had become the new center of the Ukrainian national movement.
Which year it was?
1906. And of course, it's not just about kind of generic constitutional freedoms and parliamentary democracy, however limited. It was also about freedom to develop Ukrainian national culture, because what's happening in the Russian Empire is the Valuyev circular, right, of 1863 and the EMS UKs of 1876, which basically prohibit publishing and teaching in Ukrainian language. Even Mikhailo Dragomanu, a famous Ukrainian socialist from the 19th century, kind of socialist, anarchist, liberal, who was actually quite disappointed with Galicia as a society, with the social norms, with the bigotry of the Galician intelligentsia. Nevertheless, he believed that despite all of this and all those clerical influences which he hated, among Ukrainian Galicians, he believed that Galicia would produce a new generation of truly European intellectuals and politicians. He says that only in Galicia people can naturally grow who would become both Europeans and Ukrainians. And then, of course, at the beginning of the 20th century, we have a lively migration of Ukrainian students from the Russian Empire to Lviv. One of those students was Dmitro Dontsov. Just before the war, we have the first Congress of Ukrainian students taking place in Lviv. All Ukrainian writers from the Russian Empire publish in Galicia, where they enjoy this freedom from the Russian censorship. Moreover, by the beginning of the 20th century, Ukrainian intellectuals in Galicia also feel that they are actually more experienced in comparison with their counterparts from the Russian Empire, because they do have this experience of civil society and of political democracy, and they advise their brethren in the Russian Empire, especially during the first Russian Revolution of 1905, 1907, how to behave, what to demand, that freedoms should come first, and social revolution later, and so on. And then this paradigm of freedom, this first conceptualization of Galicia ends basically with the revolution and with the armed liberation struggle, right? As this period is called in the Ukrainian historiography, the period of post-revolutionary wars or revolutionary wars. So against the background of the revolutionary chaos and violence, with the apparent failure of Ukrainian People's Republic, and this is a republic created in the Russian Empire, right, by Ukrainians, with the failure of that republic to secure its citizens' loyalty and to successfully mobilize its population to the republic's defense, Galicia's republic, the so-called Western Ukrainian People's Republic, or ZUNR, seemed to be a model of national mobilization and kind of exemplary when it comes to the Ukrainian state building. And that's why during the interwar period, if you look at the recollections and historical reflections, they all emphasize, how well this Western Ukrainian People's Republic functioned when it comes to institution, kind of organizational ability, and also population's loyalty, right? They created a regular army, and desertion was not such a big problem as in the Russian Empire. And allegedly, ZUNR lost its fight to the Polish state only because of lack of munitions, lack of international support, and also enemy's numerical superiority. And ZUNR, for those interwar intellectuals, Ukrainian intellectuals, was about organization and discipline. Right? This would be the second paradigm, sort of organization and discipline, let's call it. Galicia as discipline is at the heart of Mykola Szlimkiewicz. He's a Ukrainian philosopher who actually studied in Buchach Gymnasium for several years, graduated from a different one, but did spend some time in Buchach. And after World War II, he published his work called Galichanstvo, or Galicianism, I think, in which he defined this Galichanstvo, or Galicianism, as a rationally organized mediocrity. And the purpose of his book was kind of twofold, to explain Galicia versus Eastern Ukraine, but also to warn Western Ukrainians or Galicians from, those revolutionary experiments, because he didn't like OUN, and what OUN did during the war. So Szlimkiewicz's Galichanstvo exists in this kind of contradistinction to Eastern Ukrainian chaotic, emotional, elemental Ukrainian type, right? And it's about kind of grayness, but also disciplines, down to earthness, which is basically a prerequisite for him for successful, state building, for the modern bureaucratic organization. We also see something like this in Osip Nazaruk's texts from the interwar period, especially in his Galicia and Greater Ukraine, in which he argued that Galicia was no longer Ukraine's Piedmont, it was actually Ukraine's Prussia, or should be Ukraine's Prussia, because just like Prussia created unified Germany, Galicia would create unified Ukraine. Because people think about, he says, people think about Galicia as kind of grayness, orderliness, but it's also about solidity, punctuality, organization, and those are values, again, necessary for this difficult task of organizing, I quote from him, a great nation. And then once we pass this watershed of World War II, we also have more academic conceptualizations of Galicia. And here, of course, Ivan Lysiak-Rudnitsky, the great Ukrainian historian, was absolutely crucial. So he basically created this academic conceptualization of the Ukrainian Galician experience as, I would call it, normalcy. So in Galicia, again, because of the freedom, but also because of all those organizational things, disciplines that comes with the Habsburg state, the development of the Ukrainian nation proceeded normally, just like, with all other European nations. It went through all the required stages, and at the end we have a cohesive national community, right? The national consciousness permeates all the social classes, all the levels of the national community. And I would argue that most historians writing about Ukrainian Galicia versus the Russian-ruled Ukraine towards the end of the 20th century were working in this paradigm of normalcy. We have Paul Robert Magogy here. He is a good example. John Paul Hilmka, Roman Shpurlyuk. In one version or another, I think this paradigm is present in all those works. And it was such a powerful paradigm because it explained, or seemingly explained, differences between Galicia and the Russian-ruled Ukraine, right? While the former was normal, the later was abnormal. So just like, with Richard Pipes and his idea that the Russian empire was patrimonial, was kind of fundamentally non-European. We have something very similar happening in the Ukrainian historiography, because Ivan Lysiak-Rudnitsky, as early as 1963, said, and I quote, "Country's normal development had been warped and retarded by the dead hand of the Russian Tsarism," unquote. And he's talking about the Russian-ruled Ukraine. But as we move into the 21st century, but probably even kind of late 1990s, this paradigm of normalcy is abandoned. Right? Historians started questioning the teleology of the nation building. They looked at other possibilities for potential nation making present in this Ukrainian case. There is this famous article by John Paul Hilmka, my teacher, about Icarian flights in all directions. Right? This is a metaphor for those options available for Galician Ukrainians in the 19th century. And then there are also changes happening in the historiography of the Russian Empire and of the Habsburg Empire. So the Russian Empire is no longer seen as, this kind of Russian Sonderweg. Historians would argue that it was a normal empire in many ways, just like any other European empire. And then we have, Peter Judson's most recent kind of synthesis of the Habsburg history, as basically saying that maybe Habsburg Empire was quite abnormal when it comes to this institutionalization of nationality, national cadasters, national languages, something we don't really encounter in the case of other European empires. So all of this can be probably designated as a kind of imperial post-national turn when it comes to the historiography of Galician Ukrainians and the nation building in Galician Ukraine or Ukrainian Galicia. But the new imperial history is not without problems of its own, right? It emphasizes this common imperial imprint, and it downplays cultural differences and also cross-border interactions. Because, speaking of borders, if you look at this map that, Larry Wolf showed us yesterday, Galicia is just one long border with the Russian Empire, with Hungary to the south, and those cross-border interactions were actually absolutely crucial to kind of even everyday experience of people living in Galicia. So if we take this kind of non-imperial starting point, I think it's also valid, because the most striking think about Ukrainians in Galicia in the 19th century is the very Ukrainian choice that they've made. If you look at the first patriotic but pre-national histories that appear in both Galicia and the Russian Empire, produced by Ukrainians, right, at the beginning of the 19th century, they overlap to an extent, but they don't belong to the same intellectual project. And I have in mind Historia Russo. I'm not sure if you are familiar with it. We don't know the author of that manuscript, right? But it became extremely popular, was written probably around 1819. And as Serhiy Plokhy showed, people often think that this is kind of the first document of the Ukrainian national history, but it's not, right? The nation we find there is essentially kind of Cossack estate nation, a kind of corporate enterprise of the Ukrainian Cossack corporation or social estate. And in Galicia, we have something similar. We have Mikhailo Harasevich, who is a canon in Lviv, right, of the Greek Catholic Church, and he also wrote a very influential manuscript that circulated in many copies and was called Annales Ecclesiae Rutene. So he nationalizes, in a way, this Uniate Church tradition. Again, something Clary Wolf wrote about, right? So the Uniate Church at the end of the 18th century underwent this profound transformation from being essentially a Polish church or the Church of the Commonwealth, right, to becoming the Austrian and Ruthenian church. So for Harasevich, this Kievan church tradition, this Kievan Christianity, then becomes the Uniate tradition of the Commonwealth, and this is basically the backbone, right, of the cultural community he imagines as his own. And we have young Ukrainian intellectuals in Galicia reading this, liking this, but at the end, when they write, they produce something different. And what they produce in the 1830s is basically the project or the image of a community which is identical to the community imagined in the Russian Empire at the same time, right? So once people start writing in vernacular in Galicia and publish first books in vernacular, they arrive completely independently, right, from those intellectuals in the Russian Empire at essentially the same cultural community, right? They talk about Ukraine, more or less, the way it's understood by their peers in the Russian Empire. And it's very surprising because there were no interpersonal contacts between those young, Greek Catholic seminarists or priests in Galicia and those writers from the Russian Empire. Actually, if you are looking for interpersonal contacts, you'll find them with Russian intellectuals, right? You have Mikhail Pogodin, who is kind of official Slavophile from Moscow, kind of pro-governmental Slavophile. He travels to Galicia, he makes friends there, he corresponds with local Ruthenians. Then we have also activity in Vienna at the Russian embassy. But those kind of converted by them Russophiles in Galicia, as early as the 1840s, they feel that they are a minority. They complain about this little Russian mania, Kozakomania of people around them, people who basically identify with Ukraine as imagined by the Ukrainian writers in the Russian Empire in the 1830s, 1840s. So this kind of defiance of the imperial border, the border which was quite real, was not physically crossed by those intellectuals back in the 1830s and 1840s, was perhaps Galicia's most significant contribution to the 19th century Ukrainian project. Galicia became the ultimate confirmation of the Ukrainian national movement's raison d'etre, right? The existence of the Ukrainian cultural community, the community of people with shared vernacular culture, which could be transformed into a modern nation. And I'll stop here so that we have more time for discussion.
Thank you very much, Andriy. And I have to say, you exceeded your time by 4 seconds, which is, I was looking at. So thank you very much. And now, if you give me 20 minutes, then I would make a co-referat about Polish, the role of Galicia in Polish nation building. But because I suppose you would rather not, then I open the discussion, open the floor.
Aren't you going to have the opportunity to do that in our next round?
Yes, so I will probably I'll do yes.
Exactly. Perhaps you said something and I missed it. Oh yeah, sorry. Thank you. Lada asked me about the influence of context Ukrainians to Jews, and I mentioned that Jewish nationalists are learning from Ukrainian nationalists. They're getting institutional support from Ukrainian nationalists. They're getting political support, incredible political support, insane political support from Ukrainian nationalists, considering how they were treated in return. So I guess my question is, was it only one way, or was Ukrainian National Project getting ideas, literature, support of any kind? They support the Zionists because they want to nationalize the Jews to even the numbers out. We all know this. That they want to lower, if Jews are registering as a nation, then they're not Polish, and that's better for the Ukrainians. But are they getting anything else out of it? I don't even think they got that. They don't even think they got that out of it. But did they get anything out of it at all? Did they get any kind of support, influence, whatever?
Oh yeah, but let us collect voices if they are.
Are you referring to support from Jews or other peoples?
I guess you could expand it. I was thinking of Jews, but you could expand it. Well said.
Okay.
Yeah, so my focus was on the first half of the 19th century, right? Those beginnings, very beginnings of the Ukrainian national project, when who they learn from is basically other Slavic peoples. You have this idea of Slavic mutuality, and Jews are still at the sort of pre-national state at this point. By the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, if you look at the Ukrainian periodicals, yes, they follow what's happening with the Jewish movement. They say there are some things we should learn from, but they also feel that Jews are very disadvantaged because of this kind of diasporic nature, right? They don't have it Eritrean. Then Ukrainians actually come up with all kinds of possible solutions for this, and not all of them are, as radical as those described by Omer. So yeah, there is lots of ideas about cooperation, and they follow the Jewish movement, but only by the end, or starting with the very end of the 19th century, the late 1870s, early 1880s, it's when you have a Jewish kind of explosion, because of the pogrom partly, but then you have an explosion of the Jewish problematic.
This is a question that's really a question. I have no, there's more I don't know about this than I do. You talked a lot about historiography. Was there any institutional expression of the sorts of things you're talking about, the different trends? Is there more than a literary form that these things take?
Yeah, of course, I simplified things in my presentation. So, especially if you look in the 1990s, there is this myth of Galicia, all kinds of nostalgias in plural about Galicia, and popular representations of Galicia, which I didn't touch at all. And of course, there is the new national Ukrainian historiography, right, appearing in Ukraine in a way. It's very conservative, right? It still follows the 19th century, followed for a while those 19th century patterns. But with institutional expressions, it's interesting. There is no Ukrainian Institute of Galicia, or to the best of my knowledge, maybe Lada knows better, but we have nothing, similar to Jewish Galicia and Bukovina organization, probably because, Eastern Galicia ended in Ukraine, and you have just Ukrainian institutions. in Western Ukraine working on Galician topics.